Last time we bared witness to the reign of the incredibly progressive king who brought widespread education to his people, abolished slavery, and greatly expanded upon his kingdom. After his passing, his wife took the throne and immediately began working to preserve the more traditional lifestyle of the Malagasy people, reversing many of his reforms. In this episode of Daddies Histories, things are about to get much, much worse, and a warning before we go ahead, some of the topics discussed may be disturbing to some viewers, and I'm not just talking about my face. I've still had no word from Raid Shadow Legends, so right now the best way to support me is still liking, subscribing, sharing, and tapping that bell icon to make sure that you get notified every time I upload. If you're looking for other ways to support me, I have a merch store, I have a book available on Amazon, and if you want access to these videos 48 hours early, you can go over and check me out on Patreon. Now, until this point, Ranavalona I had fought off an invasion from the French, blown off trade deals with the British Empire, and dragged children out of schools to place them in the army. Overall, she hadn't been that bad. Yeah, she had managed to fix the infrastructure of the island, boost the economy, and bring the European powers to the table on her terms. But her pro- and anti-Christian legislation was about to come to a head. You see, when a preacher by the name of Ranavalona, I apologise if I've mispronounced that, began preaching about the return of Christ, something had to be done. According to him, Jesus would come down to abolish slavery and liberate the Malagasy. He was obviously detained and questioned. During his questioning, he brought up his belief that slaves were equal to the Queen. And we all like a little bit of equality. Who doesn't like equality? Ranavalona I. Now, having discussed her authoritarian nature in the previous video, you can probably guess where this is going. But the real question on your lips is, well, hang on, didn't her late husband, Radama I, abolish slavery? We'll get to that in a second. The court officers took the preacher and his followers outside to a series of pits where they then stuck their heads in and poured boiling water down on them. Yeah. This gave the traditional aristocrats the exact opportunity they needed to feed the Queen more stories of the Christians undermining her rule. To add to the growing problems, they claimed that they also mocked the traditional Marina religion. In response to this, Queen Ranavalona I acted completely rationally and vowed the death of all Christians on the island. On the 26th of February 1835, the Queen sent a message to the Christian missionaries on the island that the Malagasy Christian population could no longer worship in any form. Obviously, there isn't much use for a Christian missionary that can't, well, be a missionary. So, Ranavalona offered them a choice. If they had a useful skill, they could stay as long as they used that skill to aid the state. What she was basically saying is, I hate you, but gimme stuff. Which, to be fair to Ranavalona, is pretty much every government ever. The Queen ordered all Christian Malagasy to come forward and recant their faith, returning to more ancestral Malagasy customs. On the plus side, however, a second French invasion seemed less and less likely by the day.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
However, a Frenchman would make his way fairly high up the Marina chain of command. A shipwrecked engineer known as Jean Laborde became a close ally of the Queen's. It was rumoured that unlike the French soldiers who had come to Madagascar before him, Laborde wouldn't find his head on a stick. But Ranavalona would find herself on his. The engineer would go on to build Mantazo, with the permission of the Queen. Mantazo was essentially a factory town that became the forefront of the industrialisation of Madagascar, meaning that she could get rid of the Christian missionaries and pursue an almost completely anti-Christian policy. And unsurprisingly, at this time Ranavalona seemed to get angrier and far more traditionalist. One possible reason that Ranavalona seemed to grow more unhinged as her reign went on is that early on in her reign she was influenced by the young Prime Minister Andrew Mahaja. And again, I apologise if I mispronounced that. Now, you may be wondering, how much did he influence her? Well, he's rumoured to be the actual father of her son Rakoto. The Prime Minister was very much in support of Ranavalona's late husband's very progressive and pro-Western reforms. As you can guess, this made him a lot of enemies within the Malagasy government and court. Apologies for this little interjection from editing, Daddy. But I forgot to say this next line, so I'm saying it now, so that you don't miss out on any of my amazing content. But one such faction was led by 3 sons of the Andafirvarata family, 2 of which, it is alleged, were also cracking on Ranavalona I. So she really was playing Crusader Kings 2 at this point. Now, her lover, the Prime Minister, was accused of betraying the Queen with another woman, even though she had been getting her plumbing fixed elsewhere as well. The young statesman was ordered to take the trial of Tangina. He instead chose to have his throat pierced by a spear, which is ironic given he had been piercing Ranavalona with his spear for quite a while. Now, you may be wondering, what is the trial of Tangina? Well, to put it simply, it's a process where you ingest a poison from the Tangina nut and then go on to eat 3 chicken skins and, well, you have to sick those up. If you don't successfully sick all 3 chicken skins up, you're guilty. If you unalive during the process, you're guilty. Queen Ranavalona I also favoured a particular form of torture known as progressive amputation, which I'm guessing I don't need to explain. She particularly enjoyed using this technique on Malagasy populations that weren't ethnically Merina. Not only did they have to undergo this horrific torture method, but these same populations were then looted and pillaged by the army. You see, the unpaid military units were given the right to loot, pillage, burn down entire villages, and force themselves upon absolutely anyone they wanted to. The only catch to this deal was that they couldn't be Merina. I'm beginning to see a pattern here I don't like. As the Queen's reign of terror continued, her subjects began to suffer under the traditional practice of Fanampuana. Now, remember when we was talking about the preacher who said that slaves were equal to the Queen? Well, this is the system used to get around the fact that slavery was illegal. You see, if you couldn't pay the Queen's ever-rising taxes, you were pushed into forced labour. The jobs you could be forced into ranged from anything from being a builder, a litter carrier for the aristocracy, or being pressed into military service as a foot soldier, to slavery. She brought back slavery. All because the poorer populations couldn't afford her taxes. The living conditions of the people forced into this horrific practice were obviously subpar. In fact, thousands would pass on just from disease and malnourishment caused by the awful working conditions and the squalor that they were forced to live in. In all honesty, many would pass away just purely from exhaustion as well as the disease and malnourishment, where they were just being worked to the bone on top of barely getting any sleep and not really being fed. Again, this is all because they couldn't pay the Queen's exuberant taxes. She was truly no libertarian, but with her industrialisation, she had certainly made a great leap forward. Oh, and to make things worse, she did actually end up importing slaves. So, yeah. When she wasn't busy targeting other ethnicities or just the poor, she was busy targeting her least favourite group of all, the Christians. In 1836, the Malagasy army actually took 14 Christian leaders because they wouldn't renounce their faith. I don't know what made anyone think they would, because this is quite literally the religion that converted the Roman Empire. You know, the one that fed them to lions. The Diocletian wannabe would have the men strung up over cliffs via a rope, and then one by one the ropes would be cut, causing each man to plummet to his passing. Ranavalona would only get worse as time went on. In fact, perhaps one of the most famous examples of her growing malice was the buffalo hunt of 1845. The Queen ordered the buffalo hunt suddenly with a severe lack of preparation. This was then compounded by the sheer number of people that were involved. Her gigantic entourage that included members of the aristocracy, servants, slaves, numbered around 50,000 people. Now, obviously, there's no way you can carry supplies for around 50,000 people through thick jungle without at least a little bit of planning. In fact, you probably almost always need some serious planning. So as they searched for the elusive buffalo, people would build roads, level villages to build said roads, and burn wood to survive. They literally destroyed chunks of forest and displaced entire communities because they were making it up as they went along. Not only that, but many of the party would themselves succumb to malaria and starvation, and this included some of the nobles who were travelling with the Queen. According to Keith Laidler, in total 10,000 men, women and children are said to have perished during the 16 weeks of the Queen's hunt. In all this time, there is no record of a single buffalo being shot. Now, in modern times, the great powers of the world love a good intervention when their bottom line is at risk. So on the 13th of May 1845, Pol Pot's sister from another mister passed a new law. This law ordered all foreigners to perform unpaid labour in the execution of public works. Essentially, it was another way of getting slaves that weren't slaves. This bish. For obvious reasons, the expats living on the island hated this idea and many refused. They were given 11 days to leave Madagascar. I won't lie, with how things have gone so far in general, I think they got off lightly. Very lightly. Now, of course, not everyone was really that happy with having to leave their lives on Madagascar behind. On the east coast, a British trader in Tamatave wrote a letter to the governor of the British colony of Mauritius. They explained their absolute fury at the situation and the fact that their trade was now being affected. Now, if there's one thing in history that the British Empire gets very upset about if it's affected, is its trade. And if you don't get that reference, don't worry, you can just ask Qing China. Because history is ever confusing, the British sent Captain William Kelly of the HMS Conway alongside two French vessels, the Berkiu and the Zealy, to investigate. The French wanted to launch a punitive expedition onto the island because they hadn't learnt from the last time, and for some reason, Kelly agreed. The Anglo-French force would attack the fort of Tamatave on the 15th of June. As they forced their way past the weak palisades, they realised they had forced their way into a trap. The palisades were just a decoy whilst the well-trained Marina army launched a counter-attack from the real fort. The Anglo-French Marines suffered the passing of 21 men, whilst a further 53 were injured. The skulls of the 21 men were impaled on spikes as a warning to the Europeans. The Queen would not tolerate trespassers. After this, the British and the French surprisingly went, yeah, fair enough, we'll just leave you to it.
I'll be back.
Now, the merchants, British and French, weren't the only people who had grown tired of Ranavalona's shenanigans. Her own son, Rakoto, was now all grown up and had really distanced himself from his mother's policies. He had the radical notion that chicken skin trials and sneaky slavery might be a bad thing. For obvious reasons, he became adored amongst the Malagasy people, feeding an underfed foot soldier and using his status to release prisoners. Rakoto would eventually become friends with a wealthy French businessman called Joseph Francois Lambert. He had made his money on Mauritius from the slave trade and was first summoned to Madagascar after he saved some marina soldiers with his ships. The foot soldiers had been surrounded by some rebellious farmers. Rakoto and Joseph would begin formulating a plot to overthrow the prince's mother in 1854, but this wasn't some grand gesture of generosity to mankind. On the 28th of June 1855, the two conspirators signed an agreement for Lambert to go back to Europe and gather support for their cause. In return for his help, Lambert received the rights to all of the minerals, resources and now vacant estates on Madagascar. Rakoto would only receive 10% of the profits. Firstly, the Frenchman wrote a letter to the French Emperor Napoleon III, asking him to invade the island and establish a protectorate. The Bonaparte would get involved with colonial ventures, but at this current time was deeply influenced by the Soissons school of foreign policy. Essentially, this meant that he was focusing on Catholic missionary work and ruling indirectly rather than military intervention. Lambert toured Europe in order to gain support for the Malagasy cause, but in 1857, he returned to the island with absolutely nothing to show for his efforts. With little other choice, the desperate conspirators recruited the shipwrecked engineer and alleged lover of Ranavalona, Laborde. So they set the coup in motion, but it failed horribly. Like a real-life Cersei Lannister, Ranavalona had been informed of what was coming by her vast network of spies. Perhaps for some dramatic flair, she had waited until the last second to arrest the conspirators. Lambert, however, managed to escape. Rakoto, being the Queen's son, was spared any punishment, but the rest of the conspirators were sent on a forced march across the island swamps. Many of them would pass away due to malaria. Now, the European invention of soap intrigued Ranavalona, and once she had the know-how how to make it from the people that make soap, she then considered those people useless.
Oh no! The special shampoo bottle! It's empty!
Now, the reason I bring this up is because once every year, Ranavalona would take a public bath on her balcony, attracting vast crowds from miles around. After completing her bath, she would have the water poured over the crowds below. She would also perform this public bathing as a way to connect to the age-old Malagasy gods. Historians now believe that the water that was poured over people was known as Queenie Girl bathwater. Also, for some reason, while she was taking these baths, she would wear a hat, and only a hat. If it makes sense, she also held lavish parties showing off her vast collection of Napoleonic art. Now, for all of the suffering she caused during her reign, the Queen was truly untouchable. That was until the 16th of August, 1861, when Queen Ranavalona I passed away peacefully in her sleep. That's right, for all of the suffering she caused, she never saw justice. She passed away at the age of 79 in Majakamidana Palace. I know I've definitely pronounced that wrong. Queen Ranavalona I ruled the Marina Kingdom from 1828 to 1861, with her reign of terror actually passing on to her funeral as a barrel of gunpowder exploded, causing the passing of several mourners. Rakoto would become Radama II, preparing to return Madagascar to the ways of Radama I. However, sadly, he was assassinated just 2 years into his rule. Even though she was an evil tyrant, the passing of Ranavalona I and Radama II would see the steady decline of Madagascar until it was successfully invaded by the French in 1896. This invasion saw Madagascar become part of the French Empire until 1960. Over the course of her reign, Ranavalona would garner many nicknames. Ranavalona the Cruel, the Mad Queen of Madagascar, the female Caligula, or as the British Quarterly labelled her, the Diocletian of our days. If you hadn't guessed, the heavy referencing to Diocletian throughout this video has been because he was the heaviest persecutor of Christians in Rome, so, you know, easy comparison. It is estimated that anywhere between 50 to 75% of her subjects were either executed, starved, worked to their passing, or unalived during skirmishes with European powers. Depending on which estimate you're going with, that's between 2 million and 3,750,000 people. This makes Queen Ranavalona I one of the most lethal leaders in history. But, as with all historical figures, views on Ranavalona I change depending on who you ask. To some, she was a vicious tyrant who enslaved and starved her people whilst living a lavish life. To others, she protected Madagascar from European imperialism. Whatever view you take, the Mad Queen is firmly stamped onto the fabric of human history. And I thank you for once again joining me as we explored that history. And I hope to see you in the next one.